If one morning you stepped down from a rattling freight wagon into the dusty main street of a small Texas town, a town where your name had never once been spoken in a kind light, what would you do? Walk away and find somewhere less harsh, or head straight for the yellowed paper pinned to the notice board. Run your fingers over the words no one had dared touch for months. And if you knew the man hiring hadn't smiled since losing his wife and child, would you still have the guts to knock on his door? Ruthie Carter did. As the wagon wheels creaked off into the distance, she stood alone in Cedar Falls, a one-street town with faded storefronts, a saloon with squeaky swinging doors, and a general store whose sign hung crooked in the autumn wind. The worn leather satchel on her shoulder carried just three things: 2 plain work dresses, a blurred photograph of her parents, and the last 3 silver dollars to her name. $3 enough for a few meager meals or one more ticket out of here. But Ruthie had run out of places to go. Have you ever stood on the threshold of a place where you knew suspicion was already waiting for you? She was used to it, from Virginia to Millerville, and now all the way here, the shadow of bad woman rumors always traveled ahead of her, slamming doors before she could even knock. No one asked for her side of the story. No one cared to listen. People preferred the easy version Ruthie had taken up with a married man, schemed to snare her wealthy fiancé. What's the truth? She knew and God knew, and that would have to be enough. When Ruthie reached the bulletin board, her eyes went straight to the paper she'd heard whispered about for weeks: housekeeper and cook wanted at Blackbryer Ranch. Good pay. No questions asked. The ink had faded. The paper was yellowed, the corners chewed by bugs. In 3 counties, no one had been foolish enough to answer it. Because Blackbryer Ranch belonged to Wade Langston, a man who might look rich and handsome from afar, but up close had eyes like a storm and the posture of someone who'd lost the will to live. His wife had died, giving birth. His only son was taken by fever before he turned 3. Folks said that ever since Wade had lived like a ghost in his stone house, speaking more to his horses than to people, his face closing like a gate whenever anyone came near. What do you think, a lone woman with a ruined name going to work for a man like that? Reckless, maybe. Foolish, possibly. But Ruthie had no other choice. And sometimes when you've lost everything, there's nothing left to fear. A voice startled her from behind. You really thinking of taking that job? The speaker was a small-framed, older woman with neatly pinned silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes. I'm Sarah Mitchell. I run the dressmakers down the street. Heard you asked about this job back in Millerville last week. That's right. I'm Ruthie Carter. If Mr. Langston will have me, I'll take it. Sarah narrowed her eyes. Folks say you're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Sarah didn't smile. She told Ruthie what people here knew and feared about Wade before the war. He'd been a good man. After the war, and after his losses, he was someone else entirely. Cold, silent, and living in a ranch that felt like a grave. His boy's name was Tommy, right? Ruthie asked. That's right. 3 years old, bright as the morning, always laughing, until the fever took him. Most strangers would have backed away at that. But Ruthie felt something like kinship, a faint echo of her own grief. She, too, knew what it was to wake up one morning and realize the world had left you behind. Sarah sighed. If you're set on it, come into my shop. I've got a few things you'll need. In the little room, smelling of fresh cloth, she handed Ruthie clean aprons, a sewing kit, a loaf of bread wrapped in paper, and a jar of preserves. I can't pay you for this, Ruthie began. Who said anything about paying? Call it an investment. If you last till Christmas, I'll have someone to talk to when you come to town. Have you ever been shown kindness you didn't expect? For Ruthie, it made her eyes sting. The walk from Cedar Falls to Blackbryer Ranch took over an hour. The road wound through golden hills dotted with old oaks under a sun that turned everything to fire. When the ranch house came into view, it looked like something from a painting. Stone walls, dark wood roof, a wide porch wrapping 3 sides barns, and corrals stretching to the horizon. But the beauty was swallowed by silence. No laughter, no voices, no laundry on the line. The first person she met was old Pete, the ranch hand who'd been there since Wade was young. He looked her over like a drill sergeant sizing up a new recruit, then nodded. "The boss is inside. But if you're smart, you'll think twice." "Would you turn back?" Ruthie didn't. She adjusted the cameo brooch, a portrait of her mother, the last keepsake from a gentler past, then knocked 3 times on the black-painted door. The footsteps inside were slow heavy, each one like a decision being made. And when the door opened, she found herself looking up at Wade Langston, tall, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, like a storm sky, with an expression she couldn't read. "I'm Ruthie Carter. I'm here about the job." A flicker of surprise, or maybe suspicion, passed over his face before he smoothed it away. "You know what this job entails, housekeeping, cooking. I can do both. The last 3 women quit. I won't." Something at the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but not disdain either. He stepped aside. "Come in." The door closed behind her, sealing her into the cool, shadowed air of the stone house. And you know, sometimes, the moment you step over a threshold is the moment fate quietly changes direction, even for someone who thought they'd run out of road like Ruthie. If you've ever walked into a place so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, you'll understand the weight Ruthie felt the moment she crossed the threshold of Blackbryer Ranch. The air inside was clean, yes, but lifeless, like a house that had been scrubbed only to keep the dust away from memories no one wanted to disturb. The wood floors gleamed, the furniture was solid and well made, but there was no scent of cooking, no hum of conversation, no hint of warmth. Wade's voice broke the silence. "Kitchen's through there. Your room's upstairs, second door on the left." His words were clipped like every syllable was rationed. $30 a month, meals included. You can leave any time you want. "And you can dismiss me any time you want," Ruthie replied, holding his gaze. For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Fair enough. You want to see the kitchen?" The kitchen itself was a marvel. A cast-iron stove big enough to feed a cattle drive, cupboards stocked with flour beans, jars of preserved fruit. And yet everything looked untouched. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Ruthie asked. "I manage well enough." "That's not what I asked." He studied her as if deciding whether to be annoyed or amused by her bluntness, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pointed out where she'd find the pump handle for water, then left her alone. That first night, Ruthie unpacked in the small but tidy room upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the cameo brooch at her throat. She'd made her choice, now it was time to prove she could make this place breathe again. At dawn, Ruthie was in the kitchen, lighting the stove. Outside, she could hear old Pete's boots on the porch and the soft nickers of horses waiting for their feed. The pantry was well stocked, better than she'd dared hope, so she set to work on a breakfast that was more than just fuel. She stirred cream into eggs, sliced bacon thick, and mixed biscuit dough with an extra pinch of salt. Wade came in while the biscuits were baking hair damp from washing beard, neatly trimmed. "Morning," he said, voice still gravelly with sleep. "Coffee's ready, breakfast will be on the table in a minute." He stood at the window with his cup looking out at the golden light spilling over the pastures. "You don't have to cook for me," he said. "Making do isn't the same as eating well." He didn't argue, but when she set the plate in front of him, fluffy eggs, crisp bacon-hot biscuits, she noticed he hesitated before picking up his fork. "Been a long time since someone cooked for me," he murmured. "Then it's about time someone did." They ate in near silence, except for the clink of cutlery and the sound of birds outside. When he finished, Wade sat back with a faint look of surprise, as though he'd forgotten what it felt like to be full. "Thank you," he said, and there was something new in his voice, a trace of warmth quickly hidden, but real. The days that followed settled into a rhythm. In the mornings, Ruthie cooked and cleaned. By afternoon, she opened the windows to let in fresh air, chasing away the stale stillness that clung to every room. It was in the parlor that she found the first hints of the life that had been here. Before, a child-sized rocking chair, a dust-covered basket where toys once lay, and empty spaces on the mantel where photographs had stood. Upstairs, she discovered a closed door beside Wade's room. She hesitated, then turned the knob. It was a nursery, a neatly made crib, a shelf of picture books, and on the windowsill a small wooden horse, its surface smoothed by careful carving. She lifted it gently, running her thumb along the grain. This wasn't store-bought. It was made by a father's hands. The voice behind her was sharp enough to cut. "What are you doing in here?" Wade stood in the doorway, his eyes storm-dark. "Just cleaning, opening things up. This room stays closed. It doesn't need cleaning. It doesn't need anything." "This was your son's room," she said softly. Don't talk about him." She met his gaze without flinching. "He was real, Wade. Pretending he never existed won't bring him back. But it won't honor him either." His fists tightened at his sides. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything that matters. Don't I?" For the first time, he looked at her as though he might believe she understood. And in a voice low and raw, he told her his name was Thomas Tommy. He'd been 3 when the fever came. Elizabeth Wade's wife had died, giving birth to him. "I'm sorry," Ruthie whispered. "Sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't fill the silence." "No," she agreed. "But hiding from their memory doesn't help either." He turned away, his control snapping back into place. "Leave this room alone. That's not a request." She obeyed, but as she closed the door, Ruthie knew she'd seen the truth. Wade wasn't cruel. He was broken. And broken things could be mended, if someone cared enough to try. That evening, she found a worn, leather-bound book in the kitchen, a recipe book with notes written in a woman's elegant hand. Elizabeth Langston's kitchen. In the margins of a cornbread recipe, it read, "Tommy likes it with honey butter." That night, Ruthie served Wade a plate of that very cornbread. He took one bite and froze. "She made this every Sunday after church," he said. "Tommy would eat 3 pieces if we let him." She let the memory sit between them unbroken by words. For the first time, she saw something shift in him. Just a flicker. But enough. The house was beginning to breathe again. And so perhaps was Wade Langston. If trouble had a smell, Ruthie thought it would ride in on the hot, dry wind that came off the southern ridge that day. The morning had started as usual, coffee on the stove, old Pete, out in the yard, fixing a gate. But by mid-afternoon, a dust cloud was moving fast across the pasture. At first she figured it was a stray rider, or maybe Jimmy from town bringing supplies. But the closer it came, the more her stomach tightened. The rider sat his horse like a man who'd never been told no in his life. He reined up near the porch and dismounted in one fluid motion. Broad-shouldered, silver-streaked hair boots, polished like he was heading to a city meeting instead of crossing prairie dirt. "Miss Carter." I presume he said smile, smooth as cream. "Silas Morton. I believe you work for Wade Langston." The name was a stone in her gut. Wade had mentioned him once, his tone colder than January water. Morton was the man Wade had carried out of enemy territory during the war, the man he later called the biggest mistake he ever saved. "Mr. Langston isn't here," Ruthie said, keeping her voice level. "That's fine. I came to see you." Something in the way he said it made her want to step back, but she stayed where she was, fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. "I've heard you've been good for the place," Morton went on. "Got the house looking lived in again. Even made Wade a bit more human. That's no small feat." "I'm just the housekeeper. Are you?" His eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing her like cattle at market. "From what I see, you're more than that. And I'm a man who likes to know everything about people who matter in my dealings." The next words came like the crack of a whip. "I know about Virginia, the fiancé, the married man, the accusations, the way you had to leave town twice." Ruthie felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her chin up. "That's none of your concern." "Oh, but it is. You see, Wade has something I want this ranch, and you, my dear, are leverage." He pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it just out of reach. "Statement from a Richard Peaton, Does the name ring a bell? He's still willing to tell a very interesting story about you, one that could ruin you, and by extension, Wade. Ruthie's breath caught. She hadn't heard that name in years, but the hurt was still there, raw as an unhealed wound. Whatever he told you, it's a lie. Truth lie, it's all the same in the court of public opinion. What matters is what people believe. She hated how calm he looked, like a cat batting a mouse just to see it twitch. What do you want to convince Wade to sell me the ranch? You've got influence over him. Use it. Do that, and your past stays buried. You walk away with enough money to live comfortably anywhere you choose, and if I refuse, then I'll burn you both down, piece by piece. Him first by proving what kind of woman he's got under his roof. Then you by making sure every decent soul from here to Mexico knows exactly who you are. Her hands were trembling now, but she kept her voice steady. Get off this property. I'll give you a week to think about it, Morton said, swinging back into the saddle. And if you're smart, you won't breathe a word of this to Wade. Men get unpredictable when they feel deceived. He rode off without a backward glance, leaving her standing on the porch with her pulse hammering in her ears. When Wade returned an hour later, dusty from riding the fence line, he took one look at her pale face. What's wrong? Nothing, she said quickly. Just tired. He studied her for a long moment but let it go. That night as they sat by the fire, he seemed restless, glancing her way as if he wanted to say something, but couldn't quite find the words. Finally, he disappeared upstairs and came back with a small wooden box. Inside was a silver locket, tarnished but beautiful. It was Elizabeth's, he said softly. Her mother gave it to her on our wedding day. He fastened it gently around her neck. I've been holding on so tight to her memory I forgot how to live. But you've shown me that loving someone new doesn't mean forgetting someone old. Ruthie touched the locket, her throat tight. She wanted to tell him everything right then, the threat, the lies, but the words stuck. How could she drop that weight on him now, just when he'd begun to smile again? Over the next days, she carried Morton's deadline like a stone in her pocket. Every time Wade laughed, every time the house felt warmer, she thought of how quickly it could all be snatched away. She avoided the topic, telling herself she just needed more time to think. Then came the news from Jimmy Morton had made an offer on the Becker place to the south. Paid in cash. Folks in town were talking about him sniffing around for water rights. Wade's face hardened like carved rock when he heard it. I should have known he'd show up eventually. When Ruthie asked who Morton was to him, Wade's voice was low and flat. A man I saved in the war, and I've regretted it ever since. He doesn't just want land, he wants to own everyone on it. That night, Ruthie lay awake listening to the wind scrape branches against the windows. Morton's face kept rising in her mind, smiling like a man who knew he'd already won. But she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of being right. The problem was to fight him. She'd have to stand beside Wade with all her secrets in the open. And she wasn't sure she was ready for that battle. Or the look in Wade's eyes when he learned the truth. It was the kind of night when the wind seemed to whisper secrets if you listened hard enough. Ruthie sat at the kitchen table long after Wade had gone to bed, the lamp casting a small, stubborn circle of light in the darkened house. In front of her lay a stack of bills to be sorted, most of them folded neatly, some shoved in carelessly. She told herself she was just tidying up the desk, but the truth was her mind hadn't stopped churning since Morton's visit. Every sound of the wind outside made her glance towards the door, as if expecting him to stroll back in with that easy, poisonous smile. She needed to understand exactly how much danger they were in, not just from Morton's threats, but from whatever legal hold he might be trying to get on Blackbryer Ranch. The desk in the corner of the study was a heavy oak piece, its drawers stiff from disuse. Wade rarely came in here. She'd learned quickly it was a room he kept more out of habit than need. Most of the papers were years-old feed receipts, livestock sales tax records. She was halfway through sorting one drawer when her fingers brushed something different. A thin envelope wedged against the back panel. It was sealed with brittle wax and marked in faded ink. to my son Wade Langston, to be opened in the event of my passing." Her pulse kicked hard. She looked toward the stairs, listening. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of the rafters in the wind. With careful fingers, she broke the seal. Inside was a letter, written in a strong, slanted hand, and beneath it several folded legal documents. "Wade, if you're reading this, I've gone on to meet my Maker. I pray you've found peace in this life. As you know, Blackbryer Ranch has been in our family since your grandfather settled here. But what you may not know is that in the eyes of the law, it belongs not to you, but to your issue, your children. This was done to ensure the land remains in Langston hands for generations. Should you die without a living heir, the property passes in trust to the nearest kin, as named in the deed. Accordingly, after the birth of your son Thomas, I filed the necessary papers naming him as the legal heir to the ranch with you, as trustee, until his majority. These papers are enclosed. If ever anyone tries to force a sale, remember no court can approve it without the heir's consent. And that heir was Tommy. If Tommy has been taken from you, God forbid know that the law will still hold the land in his name until such time as it passes to the next rightful heir. This provision may yet protect what we have built. Your father, Henry Langston." Ruthie read it twice, her mind racing. If what this letter said was true, then no one, not Morton, not anyone could legally force Wade to sell. The ranch wasn't his to sell outright. It was held in Tommy's name even after his death, until the succession line was resolved. That meant Morton's push to buy the land would hit a wall in court. But there was another problem. Wade clearly didn't know this. He'd spoken more than once as if the land was his alone burden and all. And if she told him now, he might wonder why she was going through his father's papers in the first place. Or worse, suspect she was looking for something to hide. Her fingers traced the edges of the legal documents' deed copies, the trust agreement a notarized affidavit naming Thomas Langston as sole heir. Every signature was in place, every seal legitimate. She slipped the letter back into the envelope and pressed it to her chest for a moment, the way a drowning person might clutch a piece of driftwood. The next morning, Wade was already out riding the fence line before dawn. Ruthie kept the letter tucked deep in her apron pocket while she worked, kneading bread-boiling coffee, forcing herself to act as if nothing had changed. But inside, she felt the shift. For the first time since Morton's visit, she had something more than dread. She had a weapon. When old Pete came in for breakfast, she tested the waters. "Pete, you've been here longer than anyone. Did you ever know Wade's father to talk about protections for the ranch?" The old man frowned thoughtfully. "Henry Langston. He was clever about such things. Always said land was the only thing worth fighting over." "Why? Just curious." That afternoon, while Wade was in town, Ruthie sat at the kitchen table again, this time with a blank sheet of paper. She began drafting a letter to Mr. Calloway, the only lawyer in Cedar Falls she trusted. She kept it vague, just a request for him to review certain old family documents regarding the Langston property. She would deliver it herself, quietly. 3 days later, she had her answer. Calloway's reply was crisp and unequivocal. "The provisions you describe are valid under Texas law. No sale or transfer of Blackbryer Ranch can be executed without the consent of the legal heir named in the trust. In the absence of a living heir, the court must determine succession, a process that could take years. This effectively prevents any immediate forced sale." She folded the letter carefully, her hand steady for the first time in a week. Morton might think he could bully them into a corner, but the law, ironically, was on their side. That evening, Wade came in from the cold, shrugging off his coat. He looked tired, but lighter somehow, as if the day's work had done him good. Ruthie studied him, weighing her choice. Should she tell him now, and risk the questions, or wait until Morton made his move? "You're looking at me like you've got something on your mind," he said, half smiling. "Just thinking about how much this place means to you. Means everything. It's all I've got left of them." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that it was more than a memory, it was protected safe in ways he didn't yet understand. But the words stayed put. Maybe when Morton came with his next threat, that would be the time to lay the truth on the table. For now, she let him believe the fight was still uphill. And in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, with the scent of bread rising in the oven, Ruthie allowed herself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Morton could threaten, could lie, could scheme. But she had a secret now, a quiet, powerful truth that just might be the key to keeping Blackbryer Ranch out of his hands. Forever. The fire came on a moonless night. It started with the acrid bite of smoke drifting through Ruthie's half-open window, pulling her from sleep before the first shout cut through the dark. For one breathless second, she thought she was dreaming. Then she heard Pete's voice, hoarse, urgent, shouting Wade's name from the yard. By the time she threw on her boots and ran outside, the sky to the south glowed a deep, angry orange. The wind carried sparks in low arcs across the pasture, and the dry grass drank the fire like it had been waiting all summer for the chance. Morton Wade set his face grim in the flickering light. He didn't have to explain. This was no accident. The three of them moved like a team without needing to speak. Wade vaulted into the saddle bareback, driving the cattle away from the burning grass. Pete grabbed a water barrel and rolled it toward the barn, shouting for Ruthie to start soaking the hay bales stacked inside. She hauled bucket after bucket from the pump, the icy water sloshing over her hands and soaking her skirts until the straw smelled more of cold dampness than oil and heat. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying the fire toward the barn. For a heartbeat, Ruthie thought they'd lose it all, the horses, the wagons. But then Wade came tearing back across the yard, driving the last of the cattle into the corral. He leapt from his horse, grabbed a wet tarp, and together they slapped it against the side of the barn, where the first flames had started to lick. The night roared with sound. Crackling fire, bellowing cattle, the frantic whinnies of the horses. Sweat stung Ruthie's eyes, mixing with ash until she could barely see. But slowly, stubbornly, they turned the fire. By the time the eastern sky began to gray, the pasture was scarred and blackened, but the barn still stood. They barely had time to breathe before the second blow came. Pete was the first to hear it, a distant pounding of hooves in the dark before dawn. Riders, he warned, checking the shotgun by the door. This time there was no mistaking Morton's intent. The men came fast, circling the yard, shouting slurs and threats. One hurled a lantern at the corral gate, and it smashed in a blossom of flame. Wade dropped one man from his horse with the butt of his rifle, while Pete fired into the air to scatter the rest. Ruthie grabbed a length of iron from the stove and stood in the barn doorway, daring anyone to come near the terrified horses. It was chaos, men shouting, horses rearing, gunfire cracking in the pre-dawn haze. Wade moved with a kind of lethal focus Ruthie had never seen before, his silhouette lit by the flames he was trying to beat back. Pete took a glancing blow to the head, but stayed on his feet, swinging the shotgun like a club when the shells ran dry. One man broke from the melee and charged the barn. Ruthie stepped into his path, the hot iron in her grip. "You take one more step and you'll limp for the rest of your life," she said, her voice shaking with fury but steady enough to make him pause. Behind her a horse screamed, and the man's nerve broke. He turned tail and vanished into the smoke. By sunrise, the attackers were gone, leaving behind churned, mud-scorched wood and the sharp scent of burned grass. A few cattle were missing, scattered in the night, but most of the herd was safe. The barn roof was scorched but intact. Wade stood in the yard chest, heaving his shirt soaked with sweat and smoke. He looked at Ruthie, and Pete bruised, filthy, but standing, and something unspoken passed between them. They'd held the line. "He'll be back," Pete muttered, wiping blood from his brow. "Let him," Wade said, voice low and hard. "We'll be ready." Ruthie glanced towards the blackened pasture where the first crows were already circling. She thought of Morton's smirk, his easy threats, the way he'd tried to make them feel small and helpless. Well, they weren't helpless. That night, after the animals were settled and the worst of the damage cleared, they sat at the kitchen table in silence, the lamplight soft on their tired faces. Outside, the wind had shifted, bringing the clean smell of rain from the west. He thought fire and fear would drive us out, Wade said finally. But all he did was make me sure I'm never selling. Ruthie met his eyes. There was soot on his cheek and a rip in his sleeve, but he'd never looked more alive. Then he's already lost, she said. They didn't toast to, it didn't speak of victory. But in the quiet, with the walls still standing and the herd still theirs, they knew it in their bones. Morton could come again with fire, with men with every weapon he had, but Blackbryer Ranch was still here. And so were they. The news broke in Cedar Falls the way thunder rolls over a dry prairie, fast, loud, and impossible to ignore. By the time Wade and Ruthie rode into town that morning, people were already spilling onto the boardwalks, whispering behind gloved hands. The big weathered Langston, riding beside the woman who had been the center of more than a few rumors. It was enough to set the whole town buzzing. Wade dismounted first, offering Ruthie his hand, as if they had all the time in the world. She took it, stepping down into the dust with her chin high. Her heart was pounding hard enough to feel in her throat, but she kept her face calm. Today wasn't just about them. It was about drawing a line Morton couldn't cross. Their first stop was the courthouse. Mr. Calloway, the lawyer who'd confirmed the trust papers, was waiting with a neat stack of documents. Wade signed first, his name scrawled in the broad, steady hand of a man who knew exactly what he meant. Ruthie followed her signature, looping beneath his. It wasn't just legal. It was binding in every sense that mattered. When they stepped back outside, Morton was waiting. He leaned against a hitching post like a man enjoying a show, his silver hair catching the morning sun. "Well, well," he drawled, eyes flicking between them. "I heard the gossip, but I didn't think you'd have the nerve to make it official." "It's not gossip," Wade said, his voice low, but carrying across the street. "Ruthie and I are engaged, and as of today, the Blackbryer Ranch is locked under legal protection you can't touch." A few ranchers lingering nearby turned their heads at that, their interest sharpening. Morton's smile faltered just for a moment. "You think a piece of paper's going to keep me off that land? I know it will," Wade said. "And I know the law better than you think." The crowd around them was growing, shopkeepers, stepping out cowhands, pausing mid-task, Mrs. Avery from the general store, with her apron still on. This was no longer a private exchange. Wade stepped closer, his shadow falling across Morton's boots. "You've burned my pasture, scared my stock, and tried to break my people," Wade said, voice rising just enough for everyone to hear. "But this is where it ends. You want a fight? You bring it to me, man to man. Leave my ranch, my fiancé, and my family out of it." There was a murmur from the crowd, approval from some surprise from others. Pete, standing off to the side, crossed his arms and gave the smallest of nods. Morton straightened his smirk, returning like a mask, sliding into place. "Careful, Langston. Pride makes a man sloppy." "Does he?" Wade said, turning so his words carried to the onlookers. "Pride is thinking you can take whatever you want, because no one will stand up to you. Well, I'm standing, and I'll keep standing until you're nothing but dust on the trail behind me." The statement hung in the air, heavy and final. For the first time, Morton didn't have a quick retort. He glanced at Ruthie, maybe looking for some crack in her resolve, but she met his stare head-on, her eyes steady as gunmetal. "Enjoy your little victory," he said at last, swinging into the saddle. "The game's not over. Then you'd better bring a bigger deck," Wade replied. Morton wheeled his horse and rode off the crowd, parting around him. A few people clapped. Others simply watched, measuring what they'd just seen. In a small town like Cedar Falls, moments like this became stories before sunset. Later, over coffee at the cafe, Ruthie finally let herself breathe. "You know that just painted a target on our backs, right?" Wade gave a short, humorless laugh. "The target's been there a long time. Today, I just made sure everyone could see it, and that they know I'm not moving." From their table by the window, they could see the street, the rhythm of town life picking back up. Shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, kids chasing each other down the boardwalk, cowhands tying up horses outside the saloon. But there was something else now. Something harder to name a shift in how people looked at them when they passed. Respect. Maybe even trust. By the time they finished their coffee, half the town knew not just that Wade Langston and Ruthie Carter were engaged, but that they were willing to fight for Blackbryer Ranch in the open, and in a place where land and loyalty meant everything that counted for more than any legal document. Walking back to their horses, Ruthie felt the weight of the day settle in her bones. She knew Morton wouldn't quit, not yet, but for the first time, she believed they could meet him head-on and not break. Wade caught her hand squeezing once before helping her into the saddle. "Ready to go home?" he asked. She looked down the long, dusty street toward the open road beyond. "More than ready," she said. And together they rode out of Cedar Falls, the whispers of the town following them like a wind at their backs. Not the wind of fear this time, but of something stronger. Something that might just carry them through the fight still ahead. The proposal came on a night when the air was still warm from the day, but carried that faint edge of autumn that made you notice how close winter was creeping. Wade had spent the afternoon repairing the north fence, and Ruthie had been in the kitchen, the smell of cornbread and stew curling through the house. There was no grand plan, no audience, just the quiet of Blackbryer Ranch settling in for the evening. He came in just as she was setting the table dust on his boots, his hair damp from washing at the pump. He stood there for a moment, watching her ladle stew into bowls, and something in his eyes made her pause. "You've made this place feel like home again," he said, his voice low. "And I don't just mean the house. I mean me." She smiled a little shy, but steady. "I think you've been finding your way back for a while now." Wade reached into his pocket, his hand closing around something small and solid. He took a slow breath as if steadying himself, and then he stepped closer, pulling out a simple silver ring, the kind a man buys when he's not trying to impress anyone. Just tell the truth. "Ruthie Carter," he said, "I've been walking through more years than I care to count, thinking I didn't have another chance left in me. But I do. And I want that chance to be with you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat. She looked at the ring, then at his face lined, weathered, but open in a way she hadn't seen before. She thought of all the nights she'd lain awake wondering if her past made her unworthy of anything lasting. And here he was, offering her not just love, but a place to stand. "Yes," she said softly. Then louder, with a steadiness that surprised even her. "Yes, I'll marry you." Wade let out a breath that was almost a laugh, slipping the ring onto her finger. It wasn't perfect. It turned a little loose on her hand, but it was hers. They ate dinner by lamplight, and afterward, sitting on the porch, they talked in the kind of unhurried way that comes when you know the night is yours. Wade told her about the years after Tommy's death, how he'd let the ranch slide into neglect, how the silence of the house had nearly broken him. She told him about the towns she'd left behind, the mistakes she'd made, the names she'd been called. Neither of them flinched. "Morton's not going to stop," Wade said at last. "He's the kind of man who can't stand losing." Then he picked the wrong people to push, Ruthie answered. He looked over at her, and in the faint glow from the lamp inside, she saw the faintest smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "We'll face him together," he said. "Always," she replied. They didn't make promises about the fight being easy. They didn't pretend the past wasn't still part of them. But they made something better a vow, that whatever came they'd meet it, side by side. The days that followed had a different rhythm. There was still work fences to mend cattle to move before the weather turned, but there was also a new ease between them. Pete teased Wade about finally making it official, and even the hands in town who'd once kept their distance now tipped their hats to Ruthie when she passed. One Sunday afternoon, she found herself standing at the edge of the south pasture, watching the wind ripple through the grass. Wade came up beside her, his hand brushing hers. "You thinking about winter?" he asked. "I'm thinking about all the winters after this," she said, "and how I'm not afraid of them anymore." He squeezed her hand, and they stood there for a while, saying nothing. The land stretched out before them, scarred in places from fire, but already greening again. It was the kind of view that made you believe in starting over, even when you knew how much work it would take. That night, as they closed up the barn and the first stars came out, Ruthie glanced over at Wade. "You ever think we're building more than just a ranch here every day?" he said. And in that moment, with the smell of hay in the air and the sound of the horses settling in, she knew the truth of it. They weren't just rebuilding fences and herds. They were building a life, piece by piece, nail by nail, with love as steady as the land under their boots. 6 months later, Blackbryer Ranch looked nothing like the tired, wounded place it had been the winter before. The pastures, once blackened by fire, rolled green under the spring sun. The barn stood proud again, its new roof shining faintly with fresh shingles. The fences ran straight and true whitewashed, as if to declare to every passer-by, this land is cared for. And on this day, it was dressed in its finest lanterns strung along the porch rails, wildflowers in mason jars, on every table, the scent of slow-roasted beef and fresh-baked pies drifting on the breeze. It was the Langston wedding day. By mid-afternoon, neighbors and ranch hands, townsfolk and their children were filling the yard. Some had traveled miles of dusty road to be here. Old grudges had been set aside, and even those who once eyed Ruthie with suspicion now greeted her with smiles and a squeeze of the hand. She had gone from the woman people whispered about to the woman they toasted because she had stayed fought and helped save this land. Ruthie stood in the small upstairs room, looking out over the gathered crowd. Her wedding dress was simple, but perfect. A cream calico with a lace collar, her hair pinned up with a few stubborn curls escaping in the spring wind. She held her bouquet wild daisies, sagebrush, and a sprig of lilac from the bush by the porch, and for a moment she let herself breathe in the enormity of it all. She thought of the towns she had left behind, the cold stairs, the slammed doors. She thought of the first day she'd walked into Cedar Falls, half ready to be turned away again. And she thought of Wade, how he'd looked, then worn down and half empty, and how he looked now standing tall down in the yard, waiting for her. When the music began, just a fiddle and a guitar, they met halfway down the porch steps under an arch draped in wildflowers. Wade's eyes held steady on hers as the preacher spoke, and when it came time to say their vows, his voice didn't waver. "Ruthie, you've given me back. More than I ever thought I could have. A home. A partner. A reason to keep building. I promise you my work, my name, my love for as long as I've got breath in me." Her own voice caught, but she didn't look away. "Wade, you took me in when I had nothing but my word. You believed in me when no one else would. I promise you my hands, my heart, and every bit of fight I've got left for every day we've got ahead." When they kissed, the cheer that went up could have been heard clear to the next county. The rest of the day was a celebration in true Western style, long tables, under the open sky, laughter ringing out over the pasture. Kids chased each other between the rows of benches. The men played horseshoes while the women traded pie recipes and stories about the first time they met Wade or Ruthie. Pete cleaned up in a suit that looked older than the barn itself, gave a short, heartfelt toast that left more than a few eyes misty. As the sun dipped low, Wade took Ruthie's hand and led her to the edge of the yard, where the land rolled away toward the horizon. The golden light caught on the grass, the barn, the faces of their guests. "We did it," he murmured. "No," she said softly, "we're doing it." Because this wasn't the end of their fight, or their work. Blackbryer Ranch still needed tending. The seasons would still be hard. People like Morton, maybe not him, but others would always come sniffing around for what they could take. But now they faced it all as husband and wife, as partners with a community standing behind them. And here's where I want to speak directly to you. Yes, you reading this. You've seen what they came through, the threats, the fire, the whispers that tried to bury Ruthie's name. You've seen the way Wade pulled himself out of his grief to fight for what mattered. They didn't just win a wedding day, they won a future worth working for. And I'll tell you this, that kind of grit, that kind of love doesn't happen by accident. So here's my challenge to you. Whether you've got a little ranch of your own, a family you're building, or just a dream you're holding on to, show up for it. Like Wade showed up for his land, like Ruthie showed up for a life she refused to quit on. Protect what's yours. Invest in it. Build it up so strong that when trouble comes, and it will, you can stand on your porch, look it in the eye, and say, "You're not taking this from me." And if you happen to find yourself in Cedar Falls one spring day, you might just catch sight of Ruthie on that porch apron, dusted with flour, Wade coming in from the pasture with the dogs at his heels. You might see them wave to a passing neighbor or head into town for Sunday service. And you'll know you're looking at the proof that starting over is possible. Not easy, not without cost, but worth every blister, every sleepless night, every fight you don't back down from. Because in the end, this isn't just their story. It's a reminder, for me, for you, for anyone who's ever been told they can't come back from where they've been. You can. And when you do, you'll find, just like Wade and Ruthie did, that home isn't just a place on a map. It's the life you build one choice at a time with someone who's willing to build it with you.